Okay, I'm pleased to say that I can discuss this in more detail now with James Kirkham, who's a glaciologist and a Chief Science Advisor at the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. Welcome to you, James. I'll do a mea culpa by starting by saying that I was quite ignorant, I realised, until I started to read about where the glaciers are around the world. I had no idea there were so many in Central Asia and also in Europe. When these glaciers start to melt and the water levels start to rise, does that mean that there's going to be problems for the countries that have these glaciers?
Absolutely. So global warming of the climate threatens glaciers in every single part of the world. And this matters incredibly much because water supply from glaciers is key to ensuring that humans have secure sources of energy, food, and drinking water. Now, in Central Asia, the glaciers are melting faster than the global average. And if we continue to pump CO2 emissions out at the rate we are currently doing, we could lose up to 75% of the ice by the end of this century.
I mean, obviously, the extra water, it's hard for people to imagine just how much extra water that does see going in, for example, into the seas, and sea levels are going to be rising. If we talk globally now, what impact will that have?
This has enormous impact. So in terms of sea level rise, water is rising by about 4.8 millimeters every single year. And we know that every single increment of increase in sea level makes coastal cities, which we've built across the world, much more vulnerable to storms, storm surges, and also eventually inundation from rising water levels. We know that in the worst case scenario, we could see almost a meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. And this will cause enormous challenges for coastal cities. As well as that, as glaciers begin to melt more and more, we'll reach something called peak water, which is the highest amount of water supplied from the glaciers as they melt. And as this then decreases, we'll be losing water for drinking, irrigation, and power. And particularly in Central Asia, where we've been investing in large hydropower projects to power our countries, this will be an enormous challenge because we'll begin to have stranded assets because of the melt of ice.
Obviously, there are global efforts underway to try and reverse the situation, or at least to try and mitigate it. Just in theory, though, what's the worst case scenario if we see the glaciers melt completely? It will take a lot of time. What would the world look like in that situation?
Well, the latest projections show that between 30 and 80% of glaciers will be lost by the end of this century. So that's the next 80 years or so. And this means enormous challenges for the world in terms of livelihoods, energy and food security as well. Now, we still have a really large choice about whether we end up with 30% lost or 80% lost. We've lost about 30%. That's now locked in by the warming we've had to date. However, there's a huge difference in how we can adapt to this. If we get 80%, we're facing enormous challenges will become very hard to adapt to. Whereas if we can limit the damage by acting quickly now, limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we can then get countries to adapt to this and make sure we can benefit from the enormous value of these glaciers and snow resources to populations across the world.
And as I understand it, James, there are certain countries, when the water levels get higher and higher, there's a point where some countries will struggle not to go underwater. Are we looking at the possibility of mass migration because of this?
We are indeed, yes. So we're already seeing some examples of some small island states in the Pacific, which are suffering enormous flooding frequency because of this. In the 1980s, these countries would be flooded less than 5 days per year. But in the next 30 years, they could be seeing flooding every 2 or 3 days if the waters continue to rise as fast as we are currently seeing. Only rapid emissions reductions can prevent this from becoming a reality. And it's not just these small island countries which will be affected. The G20 countries, which emit 80% of emissions globally, have cities all across the coastlines around the world. And they're going to face enormous challenges because of their emissions that they're pumping into the air to date.
James, really appreciate you coming on. Great to get your assessment of the situation. James Kirkham, who's Chief Science Advisor at the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative.